The largest banks in this country, they started out Chase and J.P. Morgan were competitors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now they're not. It's J.P. Morgan Chase.
Sure.
Well, one day it's going to be J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs,
Mm-hmm. Sure.
National City Bank, Key Bank. Everything will be a subsidiary. They'll be allowed to keep their name as a subsidiary, but they'll all be owned by one bank or one corporation like Halliburton will own all the others. This has happened in every industry, but it happened especially quick in the defense industry. Airlines, air power, missile technology, etc. And, of course, the most important, who builds the airfields?
Yeah.
Kellogg, Brown and Root.
Oh.
Now, the fact that these are all giant monopolies, we see them as Americans as standing aside because, and the Republicans are partly responsible for this, I have to say,
Mm-hmm.
is they're constantly saying that General Electric, Halliburton, and Exxon, they're in the competitive free market, and we're a free market system. Nothing could be further from the truth. These are monopoly corporations. They have no interest in free enterprise. They hate free enterprise. They want to destroy free enterprise. They're monopolists. Like Walmart wants to destroy every small grocery and retail outlet in any place that it sets down its roots. It wants complete monopoly control of the prices and the products that are delivered in that region. They're monopolists. But here's the point about the banking bailout. Even Robert Reich and Paul Krugman all have said, we should have let them fail. The banks should have been allowed to fail. Now, they're being disingenuous.
Sure.
Themselves. I agree that they should have been allowed to fail, but they're only saying they should have been allowed to fail after the fact. I was saying let them fail now. But I also would have added this if I was in an interview. But they're not going to do that. They're going to bail them out because that was the policy of the Federal Reserve for 15 years before this so-called crisis occurred. I published speeches for Jack Metcalf, Congressman Jack Metcalf, on the fact that these banks will never be allowed to fail, and the title of the speech he gave on the floor of Congress was Too Big to Fail. That was the policy 15 years ago when I was a special assistant to Congressman Jack Metcalf. That's why I was his special assistant, was to explore these very subject matters. He knew me, and his chief of staff knew me years before I ever signed on with him. So why are they too big to fail? The key, the turning point in your analysis is when you discover that the largest monopoly banks own 30% of every one of these giant monopoly multinational corporations.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
So we weren't just bailing out the banks.
Bailing out yourself.
We're bailing out all of the major corporations that are the players that fight the wars and rebuild countries. Nation building, they call it.
Mm-hmm. Nation
building is just a way of terming it that while we have combat troops killing people, we have combat troops guarding Halliburton workers while they're rebuilding the country. But Halliburton gets paid by the State Department, and the Army and Mercs get paid by the Pentagon. But now, by the way, this is a new one I just found. The State Department wants its own budget to fund military operations.
Interesting.
Hire Mercs.
So then this so-called financial crisis of the last 3 years was simply an engineered, clever way of just doing a money bomb where they can create money, loan it to the government or whatever, and then get it back to themselves.
Well, there was a foreclosure crisis, but it didn't affect the largest banks.
It wasn't that big, was it?
No, of course not. It's 100,000 homes a month now are being foreclosed upon. But while it's a crisis for you and I, if we're one of those homeowners, it's no crisis for the banks. The whole point is the banks take the property back.
Sure.
So they're not under any unusual circumstance to be bailed out. They were bailed out because of the derivatives trading. They got in a bind over derivatives trading, which is essentially gambling. And while they made a lot of money most of the time, the losses when you do lose in derivatives, when you're one of those banks, it's enormous. But the banks can't be allowed to fail because they're inextricably tied to Halliburton, General Electric, McDonnell Douglas, Raytheon,
The whole thing would just go down into a bucket of ashes, and they don't want that, right?
The military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
And that's not going to happen.
Well, then that also then gives an argument to some people that says there's really not going to be a crash, because if they wanted it to crash, they could have crashed it long ago.
Oh, there's no interest in an outright
crash. There's no profit in a crash.
No. Well, some people could make a profit in a crash, but it might be people like George Soros who's not involved in the military-industrial complex. No, that's why there's terms like a light landing.
Light landing?
At the Federal Reserve System.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, if whatever happens, their job is to see to it that it's a light landing. And so the corporations get funded, they get bailout money, they get loans, guarantees. But the interesting thing in this equation, at this point in history, is all that trillions and trillions of dollars, now it's $10 trillion to date, is not being returned, repaid, or reloaned domestically. The money has already been moved offshore, and we already have evidence and proof of it. It just doesn't make the front page. They're taking the money and setting up subsidiaries, and they're bragging about it amongst themselves, that they're enlarging their subsidiaries overseas to loan money to who? The Chinese people, the Arab peoples, the Central Asian people. They're the ones that need new homes, cars, floors, refrigerators. We already have them.
That's where the money's going.
That's where the money's going.
Well, that's an easy way to forestall inflationary effects too, Craig Hewlett, if you can keep the money out of here.
Well, that's true, the effects. But inflation has already started affecting the American people in food prices, if you haven't noticed.
Yeah, and I saw a thing where Walmart, I think they have like over half the market in about 30 states. Pretty amazing that I had no idea they sold that much food.
It's staggering.
Yeah.
Walmart used to be the single largest corporation on the planet, both in profitability and gross income. It only got outpaced because of the wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan over oil. Now Exxon is back on top.